There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain clothes of a Tuesday evening or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, and they slip into the timeline of your memory without any fanfare. You don't realize their weight until much later, when you trace the map of your own becoming and find that all the significant roads lead back to that single, unassuming point. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a cataclysmic event. It was the sound of a shower turning off, the slick squeak of a glass door, and the sight of Liam standing in the hallway, haloed by the dim, forgiving light from the living room. It was a moment that lasted no more than 30 seconds, but it was the fulcrum upon which my entire world tilted. He had walked out of the bathroom, a towel slung low and precariously on his hips, and just stopped. He didn't head for his room. He didn't dry his hair. He stood there, in the middle of the narrow hall that connected our two separate lives, dripping. Water traced pathways down his chest, catching the low light and looking like liquid silver. It gathered at the sharp line of his collarbone and navigated the familiar landscape of his abdomen, a map I had long ago memorized from a distance. He was a masterpiece of casual physics, of gravity and surface tension, and he was waiting. I knew, with a sudden, breath-stealing certainty, that he was waiting for me. I was on the couch, a book open but unread in my lap, and the silence in the apartment was suddenly thick, a tangible substance that pressed in on me. I could feel his stillness, his deliberate inaction, pulling at the corner of my vision. And so I looked. I lifted my gaze from the meaningless words on the page, and I looked at him. My eyes met his, and in that instant, a smirk, slow and infuriatingly confident, bloomed on his face. Then, as if the spell were broken, he turned and disappeared into his bedroom, leaving behind only a few dark spots of water on the hardwood floor and the deafening thunder of my own heart. That smirk was a question mark hanging in the air between us, a question I had been too afraid to even ask myself. It was the culmination of weeks, months, of a subtle and terrifying shift in the tectonic plates of our friendship. Before that smirk, there was a foundation, a history so solid and deeply rooted that I never imagined it could be shaken. We had met in college, two souls orbiting the same chlorinated sun of the university swimming pool. I was there on a partial scholarship, a quiet, lanky kid who found more peace in the muffled silence underwater than in the boisterous chaos of the dorms. My real passion was outside the pool. It was in the darkroom, watching silver halides bloom into moments, capturing the world in monochrome frames. Photography was my language, a way to observe and articulate the things I couldn't bring myself to say. Liam was the opposite. He was the star, the anchor of our relay team, a supernova of easy charm and kinetic energy. He moved through the world with an unthinking grace that I could only ever hope to capture with a fast shutter speed. Our friendship shouldn't have worked. He was the sun, and I was the quiet planet content to exist in his orbit. But it did. It started with shared lanes during grueling morning practices, the unspoken camaraderie of pushing your body to its absolute limit before the rest of the campus had even hit the snooze button. It grew over cheap diner breakfasts after, where he would talk animatedly about his engineering classes and the parties he'd been to, and I would listen, offering a quiet comment here and there, feeling seen in a way I rarely did. He never seemed to mind my silence. In fact, he seemed to crave it, as if my quiet presence provided a necessary ballast to his own relentless energy. He saw the person behind my camera, not just the guy who took moody photos for the student paper. He saw me. After graduation, when the comforting structure of university life fell away, we were both a little lost. I was trying to make a go of it as a freelance photographer, a path paved with uncertainty and instant ramen. Liam had landed a high-paying but demanding job as a software consultant, which meant he was living out of a suitcase more often than not. We were talking on the phone one night, both of us complaining about our respective shoebox apartments and flaky roommates, when he said it, so casually it almost didn't register. "We should just get a place together, Alex. It'd be cheaper. And, less lonely, less lonely." The words echoed in the empty space of my tiny apartment. I agreed instantly, a reckless, hopeful leap into the heart of the very thing I was trying to protect myself from. Living with him was a form of beautiful, exquisite torture. Our apartment became a shared sanctuary, a backdrop for the quiet domesticity I had only ever dreamed of. I learned the specific rhythm of his morning routine, the aggressive buzz of his alarm, the sound of the coffee grinder, the way he always left one cabinet door slightly ajar. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he was coding. I learned that he hated folding laundry more than anything in the world, and would live out of a clean hamper for weeks if I didn't wordlessly fold his clothes and put them on his bed. These were the details, the tiny, intimate pixels that formed the larger picture of our life together. And through it all, my feelings for him, which had started as a quiet college crush, deepened into something vast and oceanic. It was a love that lived in the marrow of my bones, a constant, low-grade fever that warmed me and weakened me in equal measure. I hid it, of course. I buried it deep, building walls of plausible deniability around my heart. I was the good friend, the reliable roommate, the quiet observer. I photographed him, not obsessively, but quietly, when he wasn't looking. Liam, asleep on the couch, the afternoon light catching the gold in his brown hair. Liam, laughing at something on his phone, his whole body shaking with it. Liam, staring out the window at the rain, a rare moment of stillness on his face. My hard drive was a secret museum dedicated to him, a collection of unguarded moments that told the story of my unspoken affection. He was, for a time, dating a woman named Sarah. She was nice enough, bright and bubbly, a perfect match for his public persona. When she was around, I would retreat, making myself scarce, my camera my shield. I'd edit photos in my room for hours, the sound of their laughter from the living room a dull ache in my chest. I told myself I was happy for him, and in a way I was. But I was also a cartographer of my own pain, mapping the precise boundaries of my place in his life. I was a fixture, a piece of comfortable furniture. And for a long time, that was enough. It had to be. To risk wanting more would have been to risk the entire foundation, to risk the quiet comfort of our shared home, to risk him. I couldn't bear the thought of his absence, so I learned to live with the ache of his presence. The shift began subtly, like the turning of a season that you only notice in retrospect. It wasn't a singular event, no dramatic breakup with Sarah. They had drifted apart months earlier, a victim of his travel schedule and a general lack of depth that even I could see from the sidelines. No, this was something internal to Liam, a slow leak in the vessel of his seemingly endless energy. His job, the one that had once seemed so glamorous with its first-class flights and expense accounts, had begun to take its toll. He was traveling 3 weeks out of every month, living in a rotating series of sterile hotel rooms, shaking hands with strangers, and selling a polished, confident version of himself. He was successful, but he was also profoundly tired. The tiredness was more than just physical. It was soul-deep, a weariness that had settled behind his eyes. He started coming home hollowed out. He'd drop his suitcase by the door, the thud echoing in the quiet apartment, and his shoulders would slump as if he were shedding a heavy, invisible coat. His usual vibrant energy was replaced by a kind of fragile stillness. The first time it truly struck me was on a Friday evening in late autumn. He was meant to be flying in from Chicago, and I expected him to drop his bags, shower, and immediately head out to meet friends for drinks, his usual ritual for blowing off steam. Instead, he walked in, looking pale and drawn, and just stood in the entryway for a long moment. He looked at me, sitting on the couch, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes I'd never seen before, not just exhaustion, but a raw, undisguised need. "Hey," I said softly, closing my laptop. "Hey," he rasped, his voice rough. "Long week." He didn't move. He just stood there, his suitcase like an anchor at his feet. Do you mind if we just order in tonight?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I don't think I have it in me to see people. The request was so out of character that it felt seismic. Liam, turning down a chance to be social? Liam, choosing quiet over noise. It was the first crack in the facade. "Of course," I said, my own voice betraying none of the surprise I felt. "Thai food." He managed a weak smile. "You know me too well." That night set a new precedent. He shed his travel clothes, took a long shower, and emerged in sweatpants and a worn university hoodie. We ate on the floor, leaning against the couch, the television murmuring in the background. He talked a little about his work, but not with the usual animated complaints. He spoke of the loneliness of hotel bars, the disorienting feeling of waking up and not knowing what city you were in, the sheer emptiness of a life lived in transit. He was confessing a vulnerability he had never shown me before, and I just listened, my entire being focused on creating a space safe enough for him to crumble in. I was no longer just a roommate. I was becoming a harbor. And as the weeks went on, his ship began to moor itself there more and more permanently. The Friday night ritual of ordering in and staying home became our new normal, a quiet treaty signed between his exhaustion and my silent, patient affection. The lines of our friendship, once so clearly drawn, had begun to blur, dissolving like watercolor in the rain. The ritual began, as most life-altering things do, as an accident. It was a few weeks into this new era of quiet Fridays. We were on the couch, deep into the second movie of a mindless action trilogy. The Thai food containers were stacked on the coffee table, and a soft blanket was spread over our laps. Liam, who had been leaning against the opposite armrest, had grown quieter over the last half hour. I glanced over and saw that his eyes were closed, his head lolling slightly. He was fighting sleep and losing badly. I was about to suggest we call it a night when he shifted, a drowsy, uncoordinated movement. He slid sideways, his body slumping against mine, and his head came to rest, with a soft weight, on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid, every nerve ending fired at once. I could feel the warmth of his cheek through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. I could smell the clean, familiar scent of his shampoo. His breath was a warm, steady puff against my neck. My own breathing hitched, and I had to consciously force myself to inhale, to exhale. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, and I was sure he must be able to feel it, that its wild rhythm would wake him. I sat there, frozen in a state of exquisite agony and sublime joy, for what felt like an eternity. Part of me, the sensible, self-preservationist part, screamed at me to move, to gently dislodge him, to restore the safe and platonic distance between us. But the other part, the part that had been starving for this for years, was resolute. It held me completely still, savoring the impossible reality of his closeness. He was trusting me, even in sleep. He was seeking comfort, and his body had, unconsciously or not, chosen me. He slept for nearly an hour where I didn't move a muscle. My arm went numb, pins and needles prickling my skin, but I ignored it. I watched the movie play out on the screen, the explosions and car chases a distant, irrelevant noise. The only reality was the weight of him against me, the quiet intimacy of this accidental embrace. When the credits rolled and the screen went black, the sudden silence seemed to stir him. He shifted, mumbling something incoherent, and his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, his gaze hazy. Then he realized where he was, his head on my shoulder, our legs tangled under the blanket. A flush crept up his neck. He pulled back abruptly, sitting up straight. "Oh man, sorry," he said, running a hand through his already messy hair. I completely passed out. "I'm so sorry, Alex." "It's fine," I said, my voice coming out surprisingly steady. I tried for a casual tone, as if this happened all the time, as if my world hadn't just been rearranged. "You were exhausted." He nodded, still not quite meeting my eyes. "Yeah, I guess so." The air was thick with a new kind of awkwardness, a self-consciousness that hadn't existed between us before. He stood up, stretched, and mumbled a good night before disappearing into his room, closing the door firmly behind him. I sat on the couch for a long time after he left, the space beside me now feeling impossibly cold. The imprint of his warmth lingered on my shirt, a ghostly reminder of what had happened. I had expected the incident to be a one-off, an anomaly born of extreme fatigue. I expected him to be more careful the following Friday, to maintain his distance, to put the wall back up. I was wrong. The next Friday, it happened again. This time, it felt less like an accident. We were on the couch, in our now customary positions. About an hour in, he yawned, a huge, jaw-cracking affair. He stretched, and then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire week, he leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder again. There was no slow, sleepy slide this time. It was a deliberate act. My heart did its familiar frantic dance, but this time, underneath the panic, there was a spark of something else. Hope. A dangerous, terrifying hope. I didn't freeze. This time, I made a conscious decision. Slowly, tentatively, I relaxed into the contact, letting my own body soften. I let my shoulder become a pillow for him. He sighed again, a sound of pure contentment, and nestled in closer, as if burrowing into a safe place. This became our ritual. Every Friday, and sometimes on Saturdays too, we would end up on the couch, and he would end up leaning on me, eventually falling asleep. The pretense of it being an accident slowly eroded, though it was never spoken of. It was a silent agreement, an unspoken truth that lived in the space between us. I became a student of this new intimacy, a connoisseur of its subtle variations. I learned the difference between the nights he was just physically tired, when his weight was heavy and limp, and the nights he was emotionally spent, when he would press himself against my side with a kind of desperate firmness, as if trying to absorb my steadiness, my calm. I was living inside a photograph I was afraid to develop, a beautiful, fragile image suspended in chemical solution. I was terrified that exposing it to the light of day, to the harsh reality of a conversation, would make it vanish completely. The ritual began to bleed into other areas of our life. It was in the way he'd stand a little too close when we were both in the kitchen, his arm brushing mine as he reached for a mug. It was in the way his bedroom door, once always closed for privacy, was now frequently left ajar. I would walk down the hall at night and catch a glimpse of him, a sliver of his life, him reading in bed, the soft glow of his lamp illuminating the pages. It felt like an invitation, another ambiguous gesture I was left to interpret. Was the open door a sign of his growing comfort with me, a dismantling of his own internal walls? Or was it just carelessness, a forgotten detail with no meaning at all? I spent hours, late at night, lying in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, turning these moments over and over in my mind, analyzing them from every angle like a detective with a handful of cryptic clues. My quiet, ordered internal world had been thrown into a state of beautiful chaos. I was living on a knife's edge, caught between the sheer bliss of his proximity and the paralyzing fear of what it all meant. Every touch was a potential promise, and every silence was a potential rejection. The ritual was our secret language, and I was terrified that I was the only one who understood it. The night it happened, the night the unspoken question was finally asked, started like any other Friday. A long week had bled into a cool October evening. The city outside our window was a glittering, indifferent sprawl. Liam had come home late, a meeting running over, and the familiar weariness was etched into the lines around his eyes. We ordered pizza, the grease and cheese a comforting indulgence. We migrated to the couch, the television casting a flickering blue light across the room. I had put on some nature documentary, the soothing tones of the narrator a gentle counterpoint to the city's hum. Liam, true to form, had taken his place beside me, and it wasn't long before the familiar, welcome weight of his head settled onto my shoulder. But tonight felt different. The air was charged with a new kind of tension, a low hum of electricity that had nothing to do with the television. He wasn't sleeping. I knew he wasn't. His breathing was even, but it was the shallow breath of someone who is awake and thinking. I could feel the subtle tension in his neck, the way his fingers were restlessly pleating the edge of the blanket on his lap. My own body was a tightly coiled spring. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, watching glaciers calve into a frigid sea, feeling a kinship with the immense, slow-motion collapse. We sat like that for a long time, bathed in the blue light, our silence a living thing between us. It wasn't the comfortable, sleepy silence of our previous nights. This was a silence full of unsaid words, a silence stretched taut with anticipation. Then he moved. He lifted his head from my shoulder, and the sudden loss of his warmth was a physical shock. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I kept my gaze locked on the television, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt him shift his body to face me. The movement was slow, deliberate. I could feel his eyes on the side of my face, a tangible pressure. The narrator on the television was talking about polar bears, about the unforgiving Arctic landscape, but his voice was a million miles away. The entire universe had contracted to the few inches of space between our bodies on the couch. Alex, his voice was quiet, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a flare in the dark. I finally forced myself to turn my head. I looked at him. His face was inches from mine. In the dim, shifting light from the screen, I could see the conflict in his eyes, the vulnerability. The easy, confident mask he wore for the world was gone. In its place was something raw and uncertain. He looked terrified. He looked beautiful. Yeah, I managed to breathe out, my own voice a stranger to my ears. He didn't say anything for a moment. His gaze flickered down to my lips, and then back up to my eyes. The question was there, in that look. The question that had been building for months. The one I had both desperately craved and deeply feared. He swallowed, a small, audible sound in the quiet room. "Would it be okay," he began, his voice raspy, hesitant, "if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The glaciers on the screen froze mid-collapse. The city outside fell silent. My breath caught in my throat. He had asked. He hadn't just done it. He hadn't assumed. He had asked. He had laid his own vulnerability bare, had handed me all the power, had given me the choice to preserve the foundation or to shatter it into something new. In that one question, he was offering me the very thing I had never been brave enough to ask for. He was giving me honesty. 1,000 panicked responses flooded my mind. The cautious friend, the self-protector, the boy who had learned to expect rejection. They all screamed at me to say no, to laugh it off, to pretend it was a joke, to retreat to the safety of the known. But the man who had sat for hours with a numb arm just to feel him close, the photographer who had cataloged every secret smile, the heart that had been quietly, patiently loving him for years, that part of me found its voice. Yes, the word was small, a tiny pebble dropped into a vast ocean, but it sent ripples through the entire room. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching a great weight being lifted from his shoulders. He leaned in, closing the final inch between us. His lips met mine, and it wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was hesitant, soft, and unbelievably gentle. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt and uncertainty, and a hope so profound it brought tears to my eyes. It was the feeling of coming home after a long, long journey. In that one, simple, terrifying kiss, the world I had known was gone, and a new one, shimmering with possibility, was just beginning. The morning after was a study in silence. A brittle, cold silence that was nothing like the comfortable quiet we had built. I woke up first, alone on the couch, a crick in my neck and the phantom warmth of his lips still tingling on mine. The blanket was tangled around my legs, and the television was displaying a serene, screensaver image of a forest. The apartment was still, too still. I sat up, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. A sense of dread, cold and familiar, began to seep into my bones. I had let myself hope. I had let myself believe. And now, in the harsh, unforgiving light of day, I was sure I had made a terrible mistake. I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. It was Liam's room. I held my breath, listening. I heard the soft click of his door opening, then footsteps, not towards the living room, but towards the front door. I scrambled off the couch and got to the entryway just in time to see him pulling on his running shoes, his back to me. He was already dressed in shorts and a tech shirt, his keys clenched in his fist. He hadn't even made coffee. "Liam," I said, and my voice sounded fragile, thin. He froze for a second, his shoulders tensing. He didn't turn around. "Hey," he said, his voice tight-clipped. "Just going for a run." "Oh, okay." The words were inadequate, pathetic. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, to talk about the night before, to ask if the kiss that had felt like a revelation to me had meant anything to him at all. But looking at the rigid line of his back, the way he was so deliberately avoiding my gaze, I knew I wouldn't get an answer. He was building a wall, brick by painful brick, right in front of my eyes. "I'll, see you later," he mumbled, and then he was gone, the front door clicking shut behind him with a sound of shocking finality. I stood there in the empty entryway, staring at the closed door. The hope that had bloomed so brightly just hours before had withered, turning to ash in my mouth. I felt like a fool, an idiot who had mistaken a moment of confused, lonely weakness for genuine affection. He had been tired, emotionally spent, and I had been a convenient source of comfort. The kiss wasn't a beginning, it was a mistake. His mistake. And now he was running from it, and from me, as fast as he could. The old, familiar ache returned, but this time it was sharper, laced with the bitter poison of a hope that had been briefly realized and then cruelly snatched away. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. We were two ghosts haunting the same apartment, moving through shared spaces without ever truly occupying them at the same time. He came back from his run that morning, showered while I was shut in my room, and then left again, saying he was going to work from a coffee shop. He came home late. The next day, he found a reason to be out with friends he hadn't seen in months. We communicated through text messages about bills and groceries, our conversations reduced to a sterile, functional exchange. The warmth was gone from our home. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of that kiss, which now felt like a wound between us. I was spiraling. Every closed door, every averted gaze, every clipped, one-word answer was a fresh stab of rejection. The narrative in my head was brutal. I had read everything wrong. I had pushed him, or let him push himself, into a place he wasn't ready to go. I had ruined the one good, stable thing in my life. My friendship with Liam, the bedrock on which I had built my post-college world, had crumbled, and it was my fault. I retreated into myself, into the quiet solitude of my darkroom. I spent hours developing film, the red safe light a comforting gloom. But even there, I couldn't escape him. I'd be staring at an image emerging in the developer tray, and all I could see was his face in the blue light of the television, his eyes full of a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability that I was now convinced I had imagined. By the fourth day of this silent war, I couldn't take it anymore. The anxiety was a physical thing, a constant knot in my stomach. The not knowing was worse than any confirmation of my fears. I would rather hear him say it was a mistake and deal with the fallout than continue to live in this suffocating limbo. I decided I had to be the one to break the silence. He had been brave enough to ask the question on the couch. I had to be brave enough to ask for the answer now. He came home late that night, looking exhausted. He dropped his bag by the door and made a beeline for his room, clearly intending to avoid me as he had been all week. I intercepted him in the hallway, the same hallway where he had stood dripping and smirking what felt like a lifetime ago. I stood in his path, and he was forced to stop. "Liam," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "I'm really tired, Alex," he said, his voice flat. "Can this wait?" "No," I said, a new resolve hardening my voice. "No, it can't. You can't just. You can't do what you did and then pretend it never happened. You can't just run away from it." He flinched at my words, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through his body. "I'm not running away," he muttered, still not looking at me. "Aren't you?" I took a step closer, forcing him to either meet my eyes or physically retreat. "Liam, look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, he dragged his gaze from the wall to my face. And what I saw there broke my heart all over again. The panic was still there, but underneath it was a profound sadness, a deep, gut-wrenching confusion. He looked lost. "It was a mistake," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I was tired, and I was confused, and I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Alex. I messed everything up." The words, the ones I had been dreading, hit me like a physical blow. But hearing them, seeing the genuine misery on his face as he said them, something shifted in me. The hurt was still there, a sharp, searing pain. But beneath it, a flicker of understanding. He wasn't being cruel. He was just scared. "Was it a mistake?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Or are you just scared that it wasn't?" That question seemed to undo him. His composure, already so fragile, shattered completely. His eyes filled with tears, and he finally broke. "I don't know," he choked out, his voice thick with unshed emotion. "I don't know what's happening. All I know is that for months, the only time I've felt okay, the only time I've felt real, is when I'm here, with you, on that couch, and it scared the hell out of me. And kissing you," he trailed off, shaking his head, unable to finish. "It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And that scares me even more. I don't know who I am anymore, Alex. I don't know what this means." He was confessing, not to a mistake, but to the truth. The terrifying, confusing, overwhelming truth. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a feeling so new and powerful it threatened to upend his entire understanding of who he was supposed to be. He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears, a desperate plea for help. He had finally stopped running. He was standing still, in the middle of our hallway, completely and utterly undone. And in that moment of total collapse, I knew we finally had a chance to build something real. The hallway became a sanctuary. All the tension that had held us in its suffocating grip for days finally broke, and what rushed into the vacuum wasn't anger or accusation, but a profound and aching vulnerability. His confession hung in the air between us, fragile and shimmering. He stood there, completely exposed, his carefully constructed world in ruins around his feet, and he was looking at me, not as a roommate or a friend, but as the only landmark he could recognize in the wreckage. My own hurt, the sharp sting of his avoidance, began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. He wasn't a coward who had used me. He was a man terrified of his own heart. "You don't have to know what it means right now," I said, my voice soft. I kept my hands at my sides, fighting the overwhelming urge to reach out and pull him into a hug. This wasn't a moment for me to take comfort, but to give it. "You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to stop running." A tear finally escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, but this time the words meant something different. It wasn't an apology for the kiss. It was an apology for the silence, for the fear, for the pain he had caused me. I was so scared. I felt like I was drowning, and you were the only solid ground, and I panicked. I thought if I could just pretend it didn't happen, I could go back to before. "There is no before anymore, Liam," I said gently. "We can't go back. We can only go forward." He nodded slowly, a dawning understanding in his eyes. He looked around our small hallway, at the door to his room and the door to mine, as if seeing them for the first time. He was seeing the architecture of our lives, and realizing that a new door had been opened, one he couldn't simply close and ignore. "Forward," he repeated, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "What does forward look like?" "I don't know," I admitted, and the honesty of it felt liberating. "Maybe it looks like talking. Maybe it looks like us figuring it out together." Slowly, I finally risked a small step forward, closing the distance between us just enough to signal my intent. "Maybe it starts with you not having to carry all this by yourself." He let out a shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "I'm not very good at that," he confessed. "Asking for help. I know," I said, a small smile touching my lips. "But I'm a good listener." That was the key. He didn't need solutions or labels. He needed a safe space to be confused, to be messy, to be honest. Our conversation that night lasted for hours. We didn't stay in the hallway. We migrated to the living room, but we didn't sit on the couch. That space was too loaded, too freighted with the weight of our unspoken ritual. Instead, we sat on the floor, leaning against opposite ends of the sofa, a respectable distance between us, giving each other room to breathe. And he talked. He talked about the suffocating pressure of his job, about the persona he felt he had to perform every day. He talked about his past relationships, how they always felt like he was following a script, playing a role he thought he was supposed to play. He confessed that the comfort he found with me, the quiet, unassuming acceptance, was something he'd never experienced before. It was real, and its realness had terrified him because it didn't fit into any of the neat boxes he had built for his life. I listened, and as I did, the last vestiges of my own fear and resentment washed away. I wasn't just a convenient harbor. I was the place he felt he could take off his armor. The ritual on the couch wasn't just about his exhaustion. It was about his soul seeking a place to rest. The kiss wasn't a mistake. It was an inevitable, desperate act of truth. When he finally ran out of words, a peaceful quiet settled over the room. It was late. The city outside had fallen into a muted slumber. He looked at me across the space, his eyes red-rimmed but clear for the first time in days. "So," he said softly, "Forward, forward," I confirmed with a nod. We didn't kiss again that night. We didn't touch. The resolution wasn't in a grand romantic gesture, but in that shared understanding. When we finally stood up, our bodies stiff from sitting on the floor for so long, we said goodnight at our respective bedroom doors. But this time, it was different. There was no tension, no avoidance. He met my gaze, and his mouth curved into a small, tired, but genuine smile. "Hey, Alex," he said, his hand on his doorknob. "Yeah. Thank you." I smiled back. "Anytime." I went to bed that night feeling a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than the fleeting euphoria of the kiss. The kiss had been a lightning strike, illuminating everything for a brilliant, terrifying instant. But this was the slow, steady dawn. This was the beginning of learning to live in the light. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. We were no longer two friends with a secret tension. We were two people, standing on the precipice of something new, and we had agreed to take the leap together. The fear was still there, a low hum in the background, but it was no longer the dominant sound. The dominant sound was hope, quiet and steady and real. The days that followed were a process of careful, intentional reconstruction. We were building a new kind of intimacy, one that wasn't shrouded in ambiguity or plausible deniability. We were learning a new language, one spoken not just in gestures, but in honest words. Forward became our mantra. It meant taking things slowly, giving each other space, and checking in. It meant replacing assumptions with questions. Is it okay if I sit here? He'd ask before settling onto the couch next to me. Do you want to talk about it? I'd offer when he came home looking worn down. We were navigating this new territory together, with a tenderness and a caution that felt sacred. The couch, once a landscape of anxiety and hope for me, transformed. The first Friday after our talk, we found ourselves in our usual spots, a movie playing, the smell of pizza in the air. The old ritual called to us, but we resisted its familiar gravity. We sat with a careful foot of space between us. But as the evening wore on, I saw him glancing at my shoulder, a flicker of longing in his eyes. And I realized the ritual hadn't just been for him. I missed it too. I missed the simple, profound comfort of his presence. You can, you know, I said softly, not taking my eyes off the screen. Can what? He asked, his voice quiet. Rest your head, I said, if you want to. You don't have to be tired. You can just want to. He was silent for a moment, and then I felt him shift. He leaned over, slowly this time, and rested his head on my shoulder. The contact was electric, just as it had always been, but the frantic panic in my chest was gone. In its place was a deep, calming warmth. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a secret. It was a choice. I relaxed into the touch, and after a moment, I hesitantly rested my own head against his. He sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated peace, and I felt his hand find mine under the blanket, his fingers lacing through mine. We sat there for the rest of the movie, our hands clasped, our heads together, not as a tired man and his comforting friend, but as two people who were choosing to be close. We had found our way back to the ritual, but we had imbued it with honesty. Our home began to feel like a home again, but a better version of it. A version where the walls had ears not for secrets, but for quiet confessions and soft laughter. The domestic details that I had once observed from a painful distance now became shared moments. Making coffee in the morning was no longer a solitary routine. It was a dance we did in the small kitchen, bumping hips, his hand resting on the small of my back as he reached past me for the sugar. The door to his room was no longer left ambiguously ajar. It was often wide open. And one night, after a particularly long week for both of us, I found myself standing in his doorway. He was in bed, reading, just as I had seen him 100 times through the crack in the door. He looked up and saw me, and a slow smile spread across his face. Hey, he said. Hey, I replied, leaning against the doorframe. Long week. He patted the empty space on the mattress beside him. It wasn't a question, but a simple, clear invitation. My heart gave a familiar flutter, but it was a flutter of happiness, not fear. I walked into his room and sat on the edge of the bed. He put his book down. We didn't talk for a moment, just looked at each other, taking in the reality of this new landscape. You know, he said, his voice soft, I've never felt safe like this with anyone. Me neither, I confessed. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of my hair behind my ear, his touch gentle, reverent. Then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't like the first kiss, the one born of desperation and confusion. This kiss was calm, certain, and deeply loving. It was a kiss that said, this is real. We are real. I kissed him back, pouring all the years of silent affection, all the patient waiting, all the newfound hope into it. I slept in his bed that night, and the night after that. There was no pretext, no excuse. We simply wanted to be together. Falling asleep next to him was a revelation. To feel the steady rise and fall of his chest against my back, to have his arm draped possessively over my waist, To wake up in the middle of the night and see his face, peaceful in the moonlight filtering through the window. It was a kind of quiet, profound joy I had never imagined I would be allowed to have. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long had finally, blessedly, retreated. We found our rhythm, a new normal built on a foundation of trust and affection. It was in the big things, like him turning down a weekend trip with friends to stay home with me, or me showing him the secret museum of photographs on my hard drive, watching his face soften as he saw himself through my eyes, through my love. But mostly, it was in the small things. The way he'd bring me a cup of tea when I was deep in an editing session. The way I'd start making his coffee just the way he liked it before he was even out of bed. The way we could sit in comfortable silence for hours. The simple act of sharing space enough. We were healing, both of us. He was healing from the loneliness and the pressure of a life that didn't fit, and I was healing from the quiet ache of a love I thought would forever be unrequited. We were healing in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. One evening, months later, I was developing some new photos in my darkroom. Liam came in, letting the door close behind him, plunging us into the familiar, intimate red gloom. He didn't say anything, just came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. I continued to gently rock the tray, watching a black and white image of a winter landscape slowly emerge from the blank paper. It was a patient, magical process, watching something beautiful and clear materialize from nothing. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I smiled, leaning my head back against his chest. I thought about the journey we had taken. I thought about the fear, the misunderstanding, the painful silence. I thought about the courage it took to ask a question and the courage it took to give an honest answer. I thought about the boy on the swim team I never thought would see me, and the man who now held me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. "I'm thinking," I said softly, watching the image in the tray sharpen, its details becoming beautifully, irrevocably clear, "about how some things are worth the wait." He squeezed me tighter, and we stood there together in the quiet dark, watching the image come into focus, a perfect picture of a world made new. We had learned that the most profound changes in life don't always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on a Tuesday evening, dripping wet and smirking. And if you're brave enough to look, to really see what's being offered, you might just find that the moment you thought was an ending was actually the beginning of everything.